The first thing I heard that morning wasn't the sound of rain or traffic. It was silence, the kind that hums just before something breaks. The ovens had stopped humming. The lights above the counter flickered once and went black. For a few seconds I just stood there, staring at the dough that was supposed to rise with the sunrise. My hands were sticky with butter. My heart was somewhere between my ribs and the floor. It was my opening day. My dream, my debt, my everything, and the city decided to cut the power at 4:12 a.m. Outside, the streets were asleep. No passing cars, no footsteps, only the faint drip of water from the eaves. I took a shaky breath, trying not to panic. But the silence in a bakery without electricity feels like drowning. Everything stops breathing, including you. I whispered to no one. Not today. Please, not today. Then came the sound that saved me. The faint ring of the doorbell, cutting through the dark like a heartbeat. A man stepped in, carrying a small portable lamp. Its light spilled over the room, soft and golden, touching the walls like dawn arriving early. He wore a gray coat dusted with sawdust, his hair damped from the drizzle outside. He didn't ask permission. He just looked at the dead ovens, then at me, and said, "I heard the power grid on this street failed again. You're the new bakery." I nodded, too stunned to speak. He set the lamp down on the counter, rolled up his sleeves, and crouched by the outlets. "I'm from the renovation team next door. I can patch this until morning." "Wait," I started, but he was already working, fingers moving with quiet confidence. The sound of his tools felt like breathing returning to the room. I watched him in silence, the calm precision, the way his brows furrowed when he found a burnt wire. There was something steady about him, like he belonged in emergencies. When the first hum of electricity returned, I almost cried. He glanced back, half smiling. "See? Miracles are just physics with good timing." The ovens flickered back to life. The smell of butter and yeast began to fill the air again, and suddenly the silence didn't feel so heavy. "I never got your name," I said quietly. "Pei Xingchuan," he replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "Architect. Fixer of both buildings and moods, apparently." I laughed, despite myself. "Ju Qingyi. The girl who almost ruined her own opening day." He looked around at the half-lit bakery, the trays waiting for heat, the chaos that had been my dream. "Well, Ju Qingyi," he said, "you're back on track." When he left, he turned off the lamp and nodded, toward the window. "Your ovens will hold. You should too." The door closed behind him, leaving a trail of light that seemed to linger even after he was gone. By the time the city woke up, the first croissants were ready, uneven, imperfect, but alive, and so was I. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm, not because I was rested, but because my mind had never really gone to sleep. The blackout still haunted me, the silence, the smell of cooling dough, the face of that man who had stepped into the dark like he belonged there. I wondered if I'd dreamed him, but the repaired outlet near the counter said otherwise. I arrived at the bakery while the city was still stretching awake. The air outside smelled like damp brick and early coffee. Streetlights were blinking out one by one as dawn unfolded, slow and gold. Inside, I turned on the lights, half expecting them to die again. They didn't. The ovens hummed obediently, and yet I felt a strange emptiness, a missing sound, a missing rhythm. I was setting trays on the counter when the doorbell chimed again. I froze. He stood there, the man from last night, holding a paper cup in one hand and a small toolbox in the other. "Morning," he said casually, as if saving strangers from power outages was part of his morning routine. "I came to check if everything's still running." My heart tripped. "It is. Perfectly." I realized I was still holding a lump of butter like a shield. He nodded, eyes scanning the cords near the wall. "Good. The circuit should hold, but you might want a proper electrician soon." I placed the butter back on the counter, trying to sound calm. "Do you always visit your rescue sites the next day?" "Only when the croissants smell this good." He smiled, and for a second, I forgot what breathing was supposed to feel like. I offered him one of the test pastries from the first batch. "It's not perfect," I warned. "The dough's too nervous like me." He took a bite, then raised his brows. "Crisp, confused, but honest. I like it." I laughed. That's a generous review. It's an architect's review, he said. I spent half my time convincing old walls to stay upright. Sometimes the imperfections are the point. We ended up sitting by the window, sipping burnt coffee from mismatched mugs. The sky outside brightened slowly, turning the glass panes into gold. He told me he was restoring the building next door, a mix of modern workspace and preserved stone. This city keeps trying to erase its own stories, he said. Someone has to remind it what it used to be. Do you ever feel tired of fixing things? I asked. He looked out the window, thoughtful. Only when people stop noticing that I fixed them. I wanted to say something, but words stayed behind my teeth. Instead, I reached for the tray of freshly baked bread, tore off a small piece, and handed it to him. For breakfast, I said. Consider it my thank you. He accepted it with a small nod. You don't owe me anything, Juchingi. I know, I said, but gratitude smells better when it's warm. The morning slipped into its rhythm, mixers humming, city sounds rising beyond the glass. He helped me fix a loose hinge on the door before leaving. When he stepped out, the light caught his hair, turning it the color of early wheat. I watched him walk toward the next building, toolbox swinging at his side, and for the first time, I felt something soft unfurl inside me, like dough finally catching the warmth it needed to rise. A week after the blackout, I'd almost convinced myself that he wouldn't come again. People like him belonged to motion, to places that needed fixing, not the ones already mended. But he did come back, not with tools this time, but with a small paper bag that smelled faintly of cedar and something sweet. I tried to make bread, he said, a little sheepish, setting the bag on the counter. Did it fight back? I asked. Viciously, he admitted. Turns out, sawdust doesn't knead well with dough. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my rolling pin. You actually tried baking? He leaned against the doorframe, that calm smile tugging at his mouth. You make it look easy. Thought I'd try. Turns out, precision in blueprints doesn't help much with yeast. Yeast doesn't follow plans, I said, grinning. It rises when it feels safe. He nodded as if I'd just said something important. Then, softer. Don't we all? The rest of the morning passed quietly. He stayed to fix a loose hinge on one of the windows, claiming he couldn't stand the way it creaked. I didn't argue. The rhythm of his screwdriver tapping against the frame somehow blended into the hum of the ovens. At one point, I looked up from the counter and realized the bakery smelled different, like a mixture of butter, warm wood, and something faintly metallic. A scent I didn't have a name for, but it felt alive. That became our pattern. He'd stop by between his work shifts, sometimes to borrow a hammer, sometimes just to stand by the window with a cup of coffee while I baked. He'd tell me about the buildings he was restoring, how the city kept layering new paint over old brick, trying to hide its cracks. And you? He asked once. Do you ever want to leave? I looked at him over the counter, my hands dusted with flour. I came here to stop running. He didn't ask from what. He just nodded, like he understood. When business slowed in the afternoons, we'd open the front windows. The air from outside carried sounds of the street, vendors shouting, bicycles clicking, laughter echoing from somewhere unseen. He once told me that this district used to be a harbor quarter a century ago. You can still feel it if you listen, he said, placing a hand against the wall. The city remembers even when people forget. That night, after he left, I stayed late to clean. The smell of butter and sawdust lingered, even after I'd scrubbed the counters. I stood by the doorway, lights dim, listening to the quiet city breathing beyond the glass. And for the first time, I realized something. It wasn't just a bakery anymore. It was starting to sound like a home. It started with a single note. One morning, as I lifted the blinds, I saw a yellow square stuck to the glass. The handwriting was small and deliberate, the kind of letters drawn by someone who measured things for a living. Your croissants are improving. The edges don't collapse anymore. No name, no greeting, just that. I stared at it for a long moment before smiling. Outside, the street was empty, except for a delivery van rumbling away. I peeled the note off and kept it under the register. The next day, there was another one. Try brushing the top with milk before baking. The color will thank you. That made me laugh out loud. I didn't need to guess who wrote it. That afternoon, when he passed by with his usual coffee and rolled up blueprints, I caught him glancing toward the window. "Leaving anonymous baking advice now," I called. He looked startled, then grinned. "You read them. You make it hard not to." "Well," he said, pretending to think, "you could always write back." So I did. That night, after closing, I wrote on a piece of paper, torn from a delivery invoice. "Dear mysterious architect, the milk worked. The croissants are proud." I stuck it to the window with a bit of tape. When I came back the next morning, my note was gone, replaced with a new one. "The architect is honored. He humbly requests a test sample." That became our ritual. Every few days, new notes appeared, folded corners, ink smudges, sometimes a doodle of a croissant or a window frame. We wrote about recipes, about buildings, about mornings that smelled like both butter and dust. Our handwriting became a kind of shared language. Sometimes I'd catch him reading mine through the glass, his lips moving silently along the words. And once, I saw him press his palm briefly against the window before walking away. It left a faint print, which I couldn't bring myself to wipe off. One evening, the city lights flickered on early sunset, caught in the wet pavement, everything golden and slow. I stood inside, rearranging the pastry trays, when I noticed him outside again, reading a new note I'd written. "If buildings remember who built them, do bakeries remember who saved them?" He looked up at me through the glass, eyes warm, amused. Then he wrote something quickly on a scrap of blueprint and pressed it to the window from his side. "Maybe they remember who stayed." And for the first time, I realized that I wasn't just writing to fill silence. I was writing to someone who had quietly become part of my mornings. Someone who made the city feel a little less lonely, one note at a time. The rain came without warning. It began as a whisper against the roof, then deepened until the whole bakery felt wrapped in its rhythm. Outside, the street was slick with reflections, lamps and umbrellas trembling in puddles. Inside, I was alone, kneading dough while the storm softened the edges of the world. The first thunder startled me so much that I dropped a tray of flour. White dust rose like smoke, drifting through the dim light. I was about to close early when the bell over the door rang, and there he was again, half soaked, a crooked umbrella in his hand and a faint grin on his face. "You're still open?" he asked. I was about to close. "Good," he said, shaking rain from his coat. "Then I'm just in time." He placed a paper bag on the counter. Inside was a small jar of honey and 2 lemons. "For the cold you'll probably catch if you keep baking in weather like this." I smiled. "You brought gifts. Should I be worried? Only if you don't plan to share." The wind pushed harder against the windows, and for a moment the lights flickered. We both looked up. "Relax," he said softly. "I'm not letting your ovens die twice." He crossed the room, checking the fuse box with practiced ease. When the lights steadied, he exhaled a small, quiet relief. "Why do you always show up when things are about to fall apart?" I asked. He turned, leaning on the counter. "Maybe that's just when you notice me." For a heartbeat, I couldn't look away. The rain hammered the skylight above us, scattering silver streaks across the floor. He noticed me watching the drops and said, "When I was little, I thought each raindrop carried a story the way old buildings do. You just have to listen closely." "Do you still believe that?" I asked. He nodded. Some days, we stood there, listening. The storm was loud, but it didn't feel violent. It felt alive, a steady heart over our heads. I offered him tea, but we ended up drinking the leftover coffee instead, bitter, cold, imperfect. He took one sip and made a face. "This is terrible. I specialize in baked things, not brewed ones." He smiled, setting the cup down. "I like terrible coffee. It reminds me I'm not in control." We laughed quietly, and in that sound small, real, human, the space between us shifted. When he finally stood to leave, the rain had softened into a drizzle. He hesitated at the door, then turned back. His eyes were gentle, but something unspoken lingered behind them. "You know," he said, "you don't have to keep the lights on for everyone." "What if I want to?" I asked. "Then, just remember," he said, opening the door. "Some lights burn out, not from darkness, but from being too bright for too long." He left before I could answer. The bell chimed, and the rain swallowed the sound. I stood beneath the skylight, looking up at the water tracing paths down the glass. Each drop shimmered for a moment before disappearing, but somehow, the light stayed. The rain came without warning. It began as a whisper against the roof, then deepened until the whole bakery felt wrapped in its rhythm. Outside, the street was slick with reflections, lamps and umbrellas trembling in puddles. Inside, I was alone, kneading dough while the storm softened the edges of the world. The first thunder startled me so much that I dropped a tray of flour. White dust rose like smoke, drifting through the dim light. I was about to close early when the bell over the door rang. And there he was again, half-soaked, a crooked umbrella in his hand, and a faint grin on his face. "You're still open?" he asked. I was about to close. "Good," he said, shaking rain from his coat. "Then I'm just in time." He placed a paper bag on the counter. Inside was a small jar of honey and 2 lemons. "For the cold you'll probably catch if you keep baking in weather like this." I smiled. "You brought gifts. Should I be worried?" "Only if you don't plan to share." The wind pushed harder against the windows, and for a moment the lights flickered. We both looked up. "Relax," he said softly. "I'm not letting your ovens die twice." He crossed the room, checking the fuse box with practiced ease. When the lights steadied, he exhaled a small, quiet relief. "Why do you always show up when things are about to fall apart?" I asked. He turned, leaning on the counter. "Maybe that's just when you notice me." For a heartbeat, I couldn't look away. The rain hammered the skylight above us, scattering silver streaks across the floor. He noticed me watching the drops and said, "When I was little, I thought each raindrop carried a story, the way old buildings do. You just have to listen closely." "Do you still believe that?" I asked. He nodded. "Some days." We stood there, listening. The storm was loud, but it didn't feel violent. It felt alive, a steady heart over our heads. I offered him tea, but we ended up drinking the leftover coffee instead. Bitter, cold, imperfect. He took one sip and made a face. "This is terrible. I specialize in baked things, not brewed ones." He smiled, setting the cup down. "I like terrible coffee. It reminds me I'm not in control." We laughed quietly, and in that sound, small, real, human, the space between us shifted. When he finally stood to leave, the rain had softened into a drizzle. He hesitated at the door, then turned back. His eyes were gentle, but something unspoken lingered behind them. "You know," he said, "you don't have to keep the lights on for everyone." "What if I want to?" I asked. "Then, just remember," he said, opening the door. "Some lights burn out not from darkness, but from being too bright for too long." He left before I could answer. The bell chimed, and the rain swallowed the sound. I stood beneath the skylight, looking up at the water tracing paths down the glass. Each drop shimmered for a moment before disappearing. But somehow, the light stayed. The city felt different after midnight. Even the air had changed, quieter, heavier, as if the world had finally exhaled after holding its breath all day. I had stayed behind again, cleaning the counters that were already spotless. It wasn't work that kept me there. It was the feeling that if I left, the silence would be too loud. The clock on the wall ticked softly. The ovens were off, but the smell of sugar and heat still lingered. Outside, the street lamps burned through a thin mist. The bakery window reflected only me, hair messy, apron dusted with flour, eyes too awake. Then came a knock. It wasn't loud, just 2 careful taps against the glass. I turned, and there he was, standing outside under the streetlight, hands in his pockets, rain clinging to his coat. I unlocked the door without thinking. "You're late," I said, though I hadn't been waiting. "Couldn't sleep," he replied. "Thought maybe the bakery would still be awake." He stepped in, brushing raindrops from his hair. The smell of the storm followed him inside, damp concrete, cold wind, and something faintly metallic. It mixed with the sweetness in the air, and suddenly, the room felt smaller, warmer. "I was about to close," I said. He smiled. "Then I'll leave before you do." But he didn't. He just stood there, glancing around, eyes landing on the tray of half-prepared dough. "You bake at this hour?" "Sometimes," I said. "The dough rises better at night. No rush, no noise." He moved closer to the counter. "Can I watch?" I nodded. The mixer whirred softly as I folded the butter into layers, pressing, turning, folding again. His gaze followed every movement, not in curiosity, but in quiet understanding. "You look different when you work," he said after a while. "How so?" "Like you're somewhere else. Somewhere that doesn't hurt." I paused, my hands motionless over the dough. "That's the point," I said quietly. "You build houses. I build mornings. We both keep the dark out." For a moment neither of us moved. The only sound was the mixer and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then he said, "Maybe that's why we never see each other during the day." I smiled faintly. Maybe. The rain outside thickened again, drumming against the window. He turned toward the skylight, watching water bead along the glass. "I used to think staying late meant loneliness," he murmured. "But maybe it just means you care too much to leave." I didn't answer. I didn't have to, because in that quiet, I realized we were both doing the same thing, staying behind for something we couldn't yet name. He helped me finish the batch, his hands clumsy but gentle. At one point, his fingers brushed mine light, accidental enough to stop time for half a second. We froze. Then he laughed softly, pulling back. "Sorry, don't be," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. When the last pastry went into the oven, I turned off the lights, leaving only the glow from the timer. The entire bakery bathed in amber light, soft and alive. We sat by the counter, waiting for the smell to rise. He traced the rim of the porcelain cup he'd given me at the market, his thumb following the faint blue edge. "That cup looks better here than it did in the shop," he said. "Maybe it just needed a home." He looked at me then, really looked, and something unspoken passed between us, fragile and warm. When the timer rang, he didn't move. Neither did I. The croissants were probably burning, but for the first time, I didn't care. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. At first it was just an inconvenience, leaky roofs, slippery sidewalks, late deliveries. But by the third night, the storm had turned the streets into rivers. The city, usually so composed, looked like it was learning how to drown. I stayed in the bakery, keeping the ovens warm in case the power went out again. The wooden sign "Quiet Mornings" swung violently in the wind, slapping against the window like a heartbeat gone wrong. By midnight, the water reached the doorstep. I was standing by the counter, watching the reflections of flashing sirens in the puddles, when the door burst open. Pei Xingchuan stepped in, drenched from head to toe, rainwater dripping from his sleeves. "Why are you still here?" he shouted over the roar outside. "Why are you?" I shot back. He kicked the door shut behind him, panting. "The river's overflowing. The old canal's flooding the lower blocks. You need to leave." I shook my head. "The ovens are still hot. If I turn them off, Jiu Chingy." His voice cracked through the storm like lightning. "This is not about the ovens." For a moment, everything froze, his eyes fierce and frightened, the water pooling at our feet. And I realized he wasn't angry. He was scared. I don't know why, but I smiled. Maybe it was nerves, maybe defiance. "Then help me carry the trays," I said softly. He stared at me for a long second, then cursed under his breath and started moving. We worked quickly, lifting boxes, pushing the smaller shelves toward the back. The wind howled against the glass, and water began to seep through the doorframe. At some point, a gust of wind knocked the wooden sign loose. It crashed against the glass and fell inside, splintering across the floor. I froze. He didn't. He grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the broken glass. "Forget it," he said. "We can fix it later." But I couldn't let it go. That sign was everything, the first thing he ever made for me. The name that had carried us through silence, light, and mornings. I knelt to pick up the pieces, but he caught my wrist. "Chingy," he said, voice low, urgent. "You can't save everything." The storm raged outside, but the only sound I heard was his breathing. Close, uneven, real. I looked up. His face was inches from mine, water dripping down his temple. "I know," I whispered. "But I can try." For a moment, he just looked at me, the kind of look that says everything words can't. Then he took my face in his hands, gentle but firm, and kissed me. It wasn't cinematic. It was wet, messy, desperate. The kind of kiss that doesn't ask for permission, only forgiveness. The lights flickered again, and somewhere a transformer exploded. We pulled apart, both breathless, both trembling. He laughed first, shaky and small. Guess I really can't fix everything. Neither can I said. But maybe we can hold it together until morning. We spent the night there, sitting on the counter as the water rose and receded. He wrapped his jacket around me. The ovens cooled, the rain softened, and by dawn, the sky was clear. When the first sunlight hit the wet pavement, the world looked new again, damaged, but alive. He picked up the broken wooden sign, turning it over in his hands. "I can fix this," he said quietly. I smiled. "You always say that." He looked at me, eyes soft. "This time," he said, "I mean it." After the flood, the city moved slower. Trucks rolled through the streets carrying sandbags and soaked furniture. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before now passed buckets hand to hand, sharing thermoses of coffee, sharing silence. My bakery had survived. The floors were wet, the air smelled of rain and metal, but the ovens still worked. The wooden sign lay on the counter, broken neatly in two. He didn't come the next day, or the one after. People said his crew had been sent to help repair the damaged bridges by the river. I told myself that made sense, that he was where he needed to be. Still, every time the doorbell rang, my pulse jumped before disappointment settled back into its chair. I spent my evenings restoring the shop, drying what could be saved. The radio murmured old jazz songs, the same ones the florist used to play before the storm. When the lights dimmed, I would run my fingers over the broken wood, tracing the letters of quiet mornings like they were a map back to something I couldn't name. On the fourth night, he finally appeared. The door creaked open after closing time, and there he was, tired, unshaven, mud on his boots. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe just realer. "I knocked," he said quietly. "But I guess you didn't hear." "I stopped expecting knocks," I replied. He gave a faint smile, stepped inside, and looked around. "You fixed most of it." "Not all." I gestured toward the sign. He walked over and picked up the two halves. His thumb brushed along the split, like he was memorizing it. Then he said, "Sometimes things need to break before they fit better." I stared at him. "You really believe that?" He nodded. "Buildings, people, same principle." The silence between us was heavier than the rain had ever been. But it wasn't painful, it was honest. I poured him a cup of coffee, the same terrible kind as always. He took it with both hands, warming them against the mug. "You could have called," I said. "So could you." We both laughed, quiet and tired. He set the cup down and looked at me. "I wanted to come back sooner," he said, "but I didn't know if you wanted me to." "I didn't know either," I whispered. He leaned against the counter, eyes gentle. And now, the city outside hummed with generators and faint music. The smell of wet bricks seeped through the walls. I thought of all the mornings we had built together, one quiet act at a time, and how, even without speaking, he had become the pulse of my days. "I think," I said slowly, "there is a difference between being alone and being at peace, and I don't feel alone anymore." He exhaled not a sigh, but something closer to release. Outside, the rain began again, lighter this time, like a memory repeating itself. He picked up the sign pieces and said, "Tomorrow, I'll fix this." I nodded. And after that, he smiled, small but steady. Then we start again. Spring came quietly, as if the city had finally forgiven the rain. The streets were washed clean. Windows bloomed with new plants, and the air smelled faintly of soap and dust and beginnings. It took weeks to rebuild what the storm had ruined, but no one seemed to mind. The baker, the florist, the old man who played accordion by the corner, everyone moved slower, talked softer, as if the flood had rinsed impatience out of the air. The morning he returned to finish the sign, the sky was clear and wide. He carried his tools in one hand, coffee in the other. "Still terrible coffee?" I asked. "Tradition," he said. He set the two broken halves of quiet mornings on the counter. The edges had been sanded, the cracks filled with gold resin that shimmered under the light. "You fixed it," I said, tracing the golden line with my thumb. He nodded. The Japanese call this kintsugi mending with gold. It means something broken can become more beautiful for having been broken. I looked at the repaired sign, at how the golden veins turned its fracture into design. It's perfect, I whispered. He smiled. No. It's honest. We hung the sign together. The chain creaked slightly, and for a second, sunlight hit the gold just right, a quiet flare of warmth that seemed to settle over everything. Customers trickled in early that day, curious about the new glow in the window. Children pressed their faces against the glass, leaving small fogged prints. He stayed by the counter, helping without being asked, handing me trays, fixing a jammed drawer, brushing flour from my sleeve. At one point I said, "You don't have to keep staying." He didn't look up from the register. "Maybe I'm not staying," he said. "Maybe I'm just not leaving." Outside, the street was bright again. The same city that had drowned was now glittering puddles catching light, buildings breathing steam, laughter rising like morning heat. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, and said, "You know, every time I walk past this street, it sounds different now." "How so?" "Like it's alive," he said. "Like it finally remembered how to breathe." I smiled. Maybe it learned from us. He looked at me for a long time, then nodded once, softly. "Then let's keep teaching it." That night, when the last customer left and the lights dimmed, I stood by the window watching the reflection of our sign, the gold lines glowing faintly in the dark. The city outside was quiet, but not silent. Cars whispered by, someone laughed from a balcony, and the air pulsed gently, rhythmically, like a heartbeat you can only hear once you've learned how to listen. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to happen. I was already in it. The kind of peace that doesn't ask for attention, just breathes with you, slow and steady, like a city that has finally come back to life.